August 9, 1965, is recorded in history books as the day Singapore gained its independence, but in the mind of Lee Kuan Yew, it was not a day of liberation. It was the first day of a terrifying siege. The image of the Prime Minister weeping on national television is iconic, often interpreted by the world as the heartbreak of a man who saw his dream of a united Malaysia shattered. While the sorrow was real, the tears concealed a far darker, more primal emotion: absolute, paralyzing fear. Lee Kuan Yew was not just crying for a lost political union. He was crying because he looked at the map and saw a death sentence. To understand the genesis of the poison shrimp strategy, one must first understand the nakedness of that moment. Singapore was an island of 700 square kilometers, with no natural resources, no drinking water, and crucially, no means to defend itself. It was a Chinese-majority city-state thrust unwillingly into a volatile sea of Malay-Muslim nationalism, right at the height of the Cold War. The separation had not been amicable. It was an expulsion. And in the eyes of many hardline leaders in neighboring Malaysia and Indonesia, Singapore was not a sovereign nation, but a wayward province that would eventually come crawling back, or be taken back by force. The military reality on day zero was the stuff of nightmares. On paper, Singapore possessed 2 infantry battalions, the 1st and 2nd Singapore Infantry Regiments. But this was a mirage. These units were not truly Singaporean. They were remnants of the Malaysian armed forces. The officers commanding these men were almost exclusively Malay brigadiers loyal to Kuala Lumpur, not Singapore. The shocking reality was that the very soldiers stationed on the island to protect it were commanded by the potential enemy. Lee Kuan Yew slept in a room where he feared the guards outside his door might be ordered to arrest or assassinate him at any moment. The police force was demoralized and fractured by recent racial riots. The British were still present, manning their naval base and airfields, but their commitment was waning and their political will to intervene in a local war between Singapore and Malaysia was non-existent. Singapore was effectively a head without a body and a fortress without walls. It was, in military terms, indefensible. The threat was not hypothetical. Just months prior, Indonesian saboteurs had been setting off bombs in Orchard Road as part of President Sukarno's policy of konfrontasi. To the north, the ultras, extremist politicians in Malaysia, were openly calling for the subjugation of Singapore, viewing its independence as a threat to Malay supremacy in the region. The rhetoric was violent and predatory. Lee Kuan Yew knew that an invasion could happen in hours. A column of tanks could roll across the causeway, and Singapore would have nothing to stop them but traffic police and a few outdated rifles. The world looked at Singapore and saw a basket case, a geopolitical anomaly that was not expected to survive the decade. The conventional wisdom was that Singapore would collapse into chaos or be swallowed up by its larger neighbors. It was from this abyss of vulnerability that Lee Kuan Yew conceived a strategic doctrine that was as desperate as it was brilliant. He knew he could not build an army capable of conquering his neighbors. He did not have the population, the strategic depth, or the money to wage a conventional war of aggression. He could not win a long war. Therefore, the goal of Singapore's defense could not be victory in the traditional sense. The goal had to be deterrence through the promise of excruciating pain. This was the birth of the poison shrimp theory. The logic was visceral and biological. Singapore is a small, succulent shrimp swimming in a sea of hungry, predatory fish. It cannot fight the fish, it cannot outswim the fish. But if the fish swallows the shrimp must be toxic. It must cause such severe internal damage, such indigestion, and such agony that the fish will die or regret the meal forever. The poison shrimp doctrine was an admission of weakness masked as a threat. It was a signal to Malaysia and Indonesia that while they could easily occupy Singapore due to their sheer size, the cost of that occupation would be higher than they could bear. Lee Kuan Yew needed to build a military machine that could inflict maximum casualties in the shortest amount of time. It was a suicidal, sacrificial strategy. It implied that if Singapore went down, it would take the aggressor down with it. It was a strategy born of a cornered animal. But to turn this metaphor into reality, Lee faced a monumental problem. He needed to build an army from scratch, instantly, and he had to do it without bankrupting the state. This brings us to the central thesis of Lee Kuan Yew's governance, the inseparable link between economy and defense. In 1965, Singapore was desperate for foreign investment to create jobs. But multinational corporations do not build factories in war zones. They do not park their capital in countries that might be invaded next Tuesday. Lee realized that security was the prerequisite for prosperity. Without a credible defense force, there would be no investor confidence. Without investor confidence, there would be no economy. And without an economy, there would be no money to buy the guns needed for defense. It was a vicious chicken and egg cycle. He had to solve both problems simultaneously. He had to convince the world that Singapore was a stable place to do business, while at the same time militarizing his society to ensure that stability was real. The pressure was immense. Every dollar spent on a bullet was a dollar not spent on housing, education, or healthcare for a poor population. Yet Lee Kuan Yew argued that without the bullet, the house and the school would be burned to the ground. He had to sell this hard truth to his people. He had to convince a population of traders, coolies, and clerks, people who had historically viewed soldiering as a lowly profession for the uneducated, that they now had to become Spartans. He had to shift the national psyche from one of passivity to one of aggressive survivalism. The poisoned shrimp was not just a military strategy, it was a psychological mandate. It required every man to be ready to fight. As the sun set on that first day of independence, the lights of Singapore flickered on, illuminating a city that felt incredibly fragile. The British officers were drinking in their clubs, unaware that their time was ending. The Malay commanders were waiting for orders from Kuala Lumpur, and Lee Kuan Yew was awake, looking at the dark waters of the strait, realizing that the only thing standing between his people and extinction was an idea. He had to make the shrimp poisonous, and he had to do it before the fish decided to bite. The clock was ticking and the world was watching, waiting for Singapore to fail. But Lee Kuan Yew had decided that if Singapore was to die, it would be indigestible. And so the frantic secret quest to build an army began, a quest that would lead him to make a pact with the only other nation on earth that understood exactly what it felt like to be surrounded and alone. To understand the sheer ferocity of Singapore's drive to militarize, one must first strip away the modern veneer of stability and look at the region through the eyes of 1965. Lee Kuan Yew's anxiety was not the product of a fevered imagination. It was a rational response to a geographic nightmare. The poison shrimp strategy was not an abstract academic theory. It was a frantic attempt to build a shell before the predators struck. To the casual observer, Singapore was a trading port. To Lee Kuan Yew, it was a defenseless ethnic anomaly, trapped in a bad neighborhood, surrounded by over 100 million people who viewed its existence with suspicion, envy, and open hostility. The urgency to build an army yesterday stemmed from a triad of existential threats that converged simultaneously: the violence of Indonesia, the revanchism of Malaysia, and the sudden, treacherous retreat of the British Empire. The first head of this hydra was Indonesia. Today, Indonesia is a peaceful trading partner, but in the mid-1960s, under the charismatic and erratic leadership of President Sukarno, it was a terrifying giant. Sukarno had launched a policy known as konfrontasi, confrontation. It was an undeclared, low-level war aimed at destroying the Federation of Malaysia, which Singapore was part of until its expulsion. Sukarno viewed the creation of Malaysia as a neo-colonial plot to encircle Indonesia, and he vowed to crush it. Even after Singapore was kicked out of the Federation, the threat did not vanish. The rhetoric from Jakarta remained poisonous. Sukarno saw Singapore as a third China, a communist Trojan horse that would infect the Malay archipelago. This was not just rhetoric. The war had already come to Singapore's streets. Just months before independence, Indonesian commandos had infiltrated the island. They didn't target military bases. They targeted the psyche of the population. The most infamous incident, the McDonald House bombing of March 1965, killed 3 civilians and injured 33 others in the heart of the commercial district. The sound of shattering glass and the sight of blood on Orchard Road were fresh memories for every Singaporean. The fear was visceral. If Indonesian saboteurs could walk into a bank and detonate a bomb, what would stop a full-scale invasion? Indonesia had a massive army, a navy equipped with Soviet submarines, and an air force that dwarfed anything in the region. Singapore, by contrast, had nothing. The disparity was so comical that it was terrifying. Lee Kuan Yew knew that if Sukarno decided to turn his crush Malaysia policy into crush Singapore, the island would be overrun in hours. But while Indonesia was the loud, volatile threat to the south, the threat to the north was far more intimate and psychological. The separation from Malaysia was legally finalized on August 9th, but the emotional divorce was far from over. In Kuala Lumpur, there was a powerful faction within the ruling party known as the Ultras. These were Malay nationalists who had never wanted Singapore to leave. They had wanted Singapore to submit. They viewed the separation not as a permanent state, but as a temporary punishment. Their logic was that Singapore, cut off from its hinterland, would suffer such severe economic collapse and social chaos that it would come crawling back to the Federation on its knees, willing to accept a subordinate status without equal rights for its Chinese citizens. However, as Singapore began to show signs of resilience, the mood among the ultras shifted from waiting to aggression. There were whispers in the intelligence community of a re-annexation. Some Malaysian generals and politicians believed they had made a mistake by letting the island go. They openly discussed the possibility of marching the Malaysian army across the causeway to restore order and reclaim the territory by force. This was the nightmare scenario for Lee Kuan Yew. The 2 infantry battalions stationed in Singapore at the moment of independence were commanded by Malaysian Brigadier Syed Mohammed Alsagoff. When Lee Kuan Yew declared independence, these troops did not leave immediately. They stayed in their barracks on Singaporean soil. For months, the Prime Minister of Singapore was technically protected by the soldiers of a foreign power that was debating whether or not to overthrow him. It was a hostage situation, masquerading as a transition. The leverage Malaysia held over Singapore was absolute, and it was biological. It was water. Singapore relied on the state of Johor in Malaysia for the vast majority of its water supply. 2 massive pipelines ran across the causeway, carrying the lifeblood of the city. Every diplomatic dispute, every political argument was shadowed by the threat that Malaysia could simply turn off the tap. Lee Kuan Yew famously said that every other policy had to bend the knee to the reality of water. If the Malaysian army didn't invade with tanks, they could simply besiege the island by closing a valve. Within days, Singapore would die of thirst. This vulnerability created a deep-seated neurosis in the Singaporean leadership. They weren't just building an army to fight a war, they were building an army to secure the right to drink. The poisoned shrimp had to be toxic enough to deter a neighbor who held the keys to its survival. For a brief window, Singapore convinced itself that despite these local threats, it was safe because of the mother country. The British Empire was still the guarantor of security. The Royal Navy base at Sembawang was a massive deterrent, a visible symbol of Western power that kept the Indonesians and Malaysians at bay. Lee Kuan Yew believed he had time. He believed he had decades to slowly build up a local force while the British kept the peace. Then came the betrayal. In 1967 and accelerating in 1968, the British Labour government, facing a sterling crisis and economic ruin at home, announced the withdrawal of all forces east of Suez. The timeline was brutal. The protection that Lee Kuan Yew thought would last for 20 years was going to vanish in 4. The shock was total. Lee Kuan Yew flew to London. He lobbied, he argued, he practically begged Prime Minister Harold Wilson to reconsider. He warned that a vacuum of power would lead to war, that the communists or the Japanese or the Indonesians would rush in. But the British were unmoved. The empire was closing up shop. The announcement of the British withdrawal stripped Singapore naked. It removed the psychological safety net. Suddenly, the poison shrimp strategy went from being a long-term goal to an immediate emergency. Lee Kuan Yew realized with chilling clarity that by 1971, there would be no Royal Navy carriers in the Strait, no RAF jets in the sky, and no British Tommies in the barracks. Singapore would be completely alone. The bad neighborhood was about to get a lot more dangerous because the only policeman on the block was handing in his badge. This convergence of threats, Indonesian terrorism, Malaysian revanchism, and British abandonment, created a perfect storm of anxiety. It wasn't paranoia, it was basic arithmetic. Singapore had 2 million people and 0 tanks. Its neighbors had 100 million people and hundreds of tanks. The poison shrimp concept was born from this disparity. Lee Kuan Yew and his defense architect, Goh Keng Swee, knew they couldn't win a war of attrition. They couldn't trade punch for punch. They needed a force that could punch so hard, so fast, and so viciously in the first round that the enemy would be afraid to step into the ring. They needed an army that could mobilize instantly. They needed weapons that were superior to anything their neighbors possessed. And they needed it now. The urgency drove them to make decisions that seemed insane to outside observers, like spending 40% of the national budget on defense while the people lived in slums. It drove them to seek help from the most controversial nation on earth. The neighborhood was dangerous. The sun was setting on the empire, and the shrimp had to grow spikes before the tide went out. The realization was stark. Nobody was coming to save them. If Singapore wanted to survive the decade, it would have to learn how to kill. The search for a military savior began in a state of quiet desperation. In the final months of 1965, as the reality of British withdrawal began to crystallize into a terrifying certainty, Kuan sat at his desk in City Hall and began to write letters. He knew that Singapore could not build an army from scratch using only its own resources. The island lacked not just the weapons but the institutional knowledge. They didn't know how to structure a battalion, how to train a recruit, or how to formulate a doctrine of war. They needed a mentor. But Kuan was politically astute. He knew he could not simply ask anyone. He needed a partner that would not inflame the already boiling racial and religious tensions of the region. His first instinct was to turn to his friends in the Third World, the leaders of the non-aligned movement, who had stood with him against colonialism. He looked to India and to Egypt. He wrote to Lal Bahadur Shastri, the Prime Minister of India. Singapore had a significant Indian population, and the Indian Army was a respected professional force with British traditions. It seemed like a natural fit, but New Delhi went silent. The Indians did the geopolitical math and realized that helping a Chinese-majority city-state would antagonize Malaysia and Indonesia, two Muslim-majority nations that India needed to keep neutral in its own struggles against Pakistan. The answer was a polite, diplomatic rejection. Next, Lee turned to Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Nasser was a hero of the anti-colonial world, a charismatic figure who commanded respect across the Muslim world. Lee hoped that Egyptian military advisors would be culturally acceptable to Singapore's Malay population. But Nasser too turned his back. He was a close ally of Malaysia and Indonesia in the name of Islamic solidarity. He could not be seen propping up the infidel Chinese island against his Muslim brothers. The door to the non-aligned movement slammed shut. Singapore was politically radioactive. No one wanted to touch the Israel of the East, a moniker that was meant as an insult, but would soon become a prophecy. It was in this vacuum of rejection that the unthinkable option presented itself. If the world would not help Singapore because it looked too much like Israel, a small besieged nation surrounded by hostile Muslim neighbors, then perhaps the only nation that could help was Israel itself. The contact was made in the shadows. The Israelis, always looking for friends on the periphery of the Arab world, had quietly signaled their willingness to assist. But for Kuan, this was a gamble of existential proportions. The geopolitical optics were explosive. Malaysia and Indonesia were staunchly anti-Zionist. The Muslim population within Singapore itself viewed Israel as an enemy. If it became known that Kuan was inviting the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, to train his army, it could trigger a holy war. It could spark riots that would tear the fragile nation apart before the first soldier was even trained. Lee hesitated. He stalled. But as the threats from the ultras in Malaysia grew louder and the British withdrawal accelerated, necessity overruled caution. He gave the green light, but with one absolute non-negotiable condition: total secrecy. On Christmas Eve 1965, a small group of men landed at Singapore's Paya Lebar airport. They did not wear uniforms. They carried no flags. They looked distinctively Middle Eastern, with bronzed skin and intense eyes, but their passports did not say Tel Aviv. The team was led by Colonel Jack Elazari and later the formidable General Rehavam Zayevi, a man known by the nickname Gandhi, though his approach to war was anything but pacifist. These were battle-hardened veterans of the 1948 and 1956 wars, men who had built a state while under fire. They were the architects of the IDF, but in Singapore they were given a new identity. To the curious customs officers, to the Malay taxi drivers, and even to the uninitiated Singaporean civil servants, these men were the Mexicans. The Mexican cover story is one of the most audacious and absurd deceptions in military history. It was chosen simply because Mexicans were swarthy, exotic, and largely unknown in Southeast Asia. No one in Singapore knew what a Mexican really looked like or sounded like, so when these Hebrew-speaking officers barked orders or discussed tactics in the mess halls, they were simply acting Mexican. It was a flimsy veil, but it held because it had to hold. The government strictly controlled the narrative. The Mexicans were whisked away to the Jurong camps, hidden behind barbed wire and non-disclosure agreements. It was a charade born of survival. Kuan was effectively smuggling the military brain of Zionism into the heart of the Malay world to build a war machine that could kill his neighbors if necessary. What the Israelis brought to Singapore was not just drill sergeants. They brought a philosophy. The British model of a military, which Singapore had inherited, was based on a small professional standing army. It was a career for lifers, slow to mobilize and expensive to maintain. The Israelis took one look at Singapore's demographics and threw the British manual in the trash. They told Lee Kuan Yew the hard truth. You have 2 million people. You cannot afford a professional army big enough to stop Indonesia's 100 million. You need a citizen army. You need the entire nation to be the army. This was the transfer of the Tsahal model. The Israelis introduced the concept of national service, NS, not as a rite of passage, but as a mechanism of total mobilization. They designed a system where every able-bodied male, upon reaching the age of 18, would be conscripted for 2 years of full-time training. But the genius was in what came after. In the British system, once you left the army, you were a civilian. In the Israeli system, which Singapore copied down to the smallest detail, once you left active duty, you became a reservist. You remained a soldier for the next 13 years, later extended to 40 years of age. You kept your boots polished. You reported for training annually. You were part of a unit that could be activated with a single code word broadcast over the radio. This allowed Singapore to solve the impossible math of its size. In peacetime, the army was small and affordable. But in wartime, within 6 hours, Singapore could mobilize hundreds of thousands of men. The shopkeeper, the lawyer, the bus driver. They would all put down their tools, pick up their rifles, and report to their units. It turned the entire island into a garrison. This was the spine of the poison shrimp. A predator might swallow a small standing army, but it would choke on a fully mobilized population. But the Israelis taught more than just logistics. They taught aggression. The British military tradition was defensive, polite, and measured. The Israeli tradition was born in the Holocaust and forged in the wars of survival. It was ruthless, preemptive, and fast. They taught the Singaporean officers that because the island was so small, they could never fight a war on their own soil. If the enemy crossed the border, the war was already lost, because the artillery shells would be landing on HDB flats and downtown banks. Therefore, the doctrine had to be forward defense. This was a euphemism for preemptive strike. The Mexicans taught the Singaporeans that at the first sign of an imminent invasion, the Singapore Armed Forces, SAF, should not dig trenches on the beach. They should launch an attack into the enemy's territory. They should bomb the enemy airfields before the planes took off. They should smash the enemy armored columns before they reached the causeway. They had to push the front line away from the city. This was the porcupine evolving into something deadlier. It was the realization that the only way to protect a glass house is to kill the guy holding the stone before he throws it. The cultural clash during this training was immense. The Singaporean recruits were largely Chinese, culturally Confucian, valuing scholarship and family over physical hardship. There was a deep-seated cultural stigma against soldiering, captured in the proverb, "Good iron is not made into nails, good men are not made into soldiers." The Israeli advisors were horrified by the lack of physical ruggedness. They were brutal taskmasters. They ran the Singaporean boys into the ground. They screamed in Hebrew-accented English. They broke the soft trading port mentality and rebuilt it with Spartan discipline. They forced the officers to lead from the front, another Israeli innovation. In the British Army, the officer said, "Go." In the Israeli Army, the officer said, "Follow me." The Mexicans instilled this ethos into the pioneer batch of SAF officers. They created a culture where meritocracy ruled the battlefield, just as Lee wanted it to rule the economy. For years, the presence of the Israelis was Singapore's worst-kept secret. As the SAF grew stronger, the Mexicans slowly faded into the background. their job done, but their DNA remains encoded in every aspect of the Singapore Armed Forces today. From the uniforms to the marching cadence, from the structure of the armoured brigades to the call-up codes for reservists, the Singapore military is a tropical clone of the IDF. The plot twist of the Mexican alliance was the decisive factor in the success of the poison shrimp strategy. Without the Israelis, Singapore would have had a parade ground army, pretty to look at but useless in a fight. With the Israelis, they built a force that punched well above its weight class. It was a supreme irony of history. The Muslim nations of Southeast Asia, by refusing to help Singapore out of Islamic solidarity, forced Singapore into the arms of Israel, thereby creating the very thing they feared most: a highly militarized, technologically advanced, Zionist-style fortress in the heart of the Malay archipelago. Lee Kuan Yew's pragmatism had turned a diplomatic rejection into a military masterstroke. He had brought the most efficient warriors in the world to his doorstep, put sombreros on them, and let them build a machine that would ensure no one ever kicked Singapore around again. The implementation of the poison shrimp strategy faced an obstacle far more formidable than the lack of tanks or the shortage of ammunition. The true barrier was invisible, ancient, and deeply embedded in the collective psyche of the population. Lee Kuan Yew and his architect of defense, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, were attempting to militarize a society that fundamentally despised the military. The majority of Singapore's population was ethnic Chinese, heirs to a Confucian tradition that had persisted for millennia. In the social hierarchy of ancient China, the scholar was at the top, followed by the farmer, the artisan, and the merchant. At the very bottom, below even the beggars, was the soldier. The proverb was burned into the cultural DNA. Good iron is not made into nails. Good men are not made into soldiers. For generations, the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia had survived by keeping their heads down and their books balanced. They were traders, coolies, rubber tappers, and clerks. They were a transient people who believed that violence was the domain of bandits or desperate men with no other options. To be a soldier was to admit failure in life. Parents would weep if their sons joined the police force. Now Lee Kuan Yew was telling them that every single son of Singapore, the brilliant mathematician, the wealthy heir, and the street hawker, had to shave his head, pick up a rifle, and learn to kill. It was a cultural shock therapy of unprecedented magnitude. Module 4 explores this radical social engineering, the moment when the government reached into the soul of the nation and rewired it from a colony of merchants into a phalanx of warriors. The instrument of this transformation was the National Service Amendment Act, passed on March 14, 1967. When Defence Minister Goh Keng Swee stood in Parliament to introduce the bill, the atmosphere was tense. There were protests in the streets. Students carried banners denouncing the militarization of society. The opposition, particularly the leftists, screamed that Lee was building a fascist state or a puppet army for the Americans in Vietnam. But the government was unyielding. They launched a massive public relations blitz, not to apologize, but to terrify and inspire. They equated national service, NS, with survival. The message was stark. If you do not learn to fight, your daughters will be servants to foreign conquerors, and your sons will be refugees. The brilliance of national service lay in its dual purpose. Ostensibly, it was about defense, generating the manpower needed to flesh out the poison shrimp. But latently, and perhaps more importantly, it was a machine for nation-building. In 1967, Singaporean was a legal fiction. The people were Hokkiens, Teochews, Canton, Malays, Tamils, and Eurasians. They lived in segregated kampongs, villages, and clan enclaves. They spoke different dialects. They worshipped different gods. They had no shared history and no shared loyalty. Lee Kuan Yew realized that the classroom was too slow a vessel to forge a national identity. He needed a pressure cooker. He needed the barracks. The introduction of universal conscription created the ultimate social crucible. When a young man stepped off the ferry onto the training island of Pulau Tekong, his previous life was incinerated. It didn't matter if his father owned a bank in the central business district or if his father swept the streets of Chinatown. It didn't matter if he had been driven to the ferry terminal in a Mercedes or had walked there barefoot. Once they passed the gates, the hair came off. The civilian clothes were bagged and stored. They were all issued the same coarse green fatigues, the same heavy boots, and the same metal bowl for rice. This leveling was deliberate and brutal. For the first time in the history of the island, the racial and class stratifications that had defined colonial Singapore were obliterated by the drill sergeant's scream. A Chinese boy who had never spoken a word to a Malay boy was now digging a latrine next to him in the pouring rain. An Indian boy was sharing a canteen of water with a Eurasian. They suffered together. They were punished together. If one man failed to polish his boots, the whole platoon did push-ups in the mud. This shared hardship created a bond that was stronger than race or religion. It created a brotherhood of the helmet. Lee Kuan Yew knew that men will not fight for a flag they don't understand, but they will fight to the death for the man standing next to them. NS was designed to manufacture that loyalty on an industrial scale. However, the engineering of the soul required more than just physical exhaustion. It required a psychological rewiring of the family unit. The government had to overcome the fierce protectiveness of the Asian mother. In the Chinese family structure, the son is the carrier of the lineage, the retirement plan for the parents, the precious jewel. Sending him into the jungle to fire live ammunition was anathema. To combat this, Singapore launched a propaganda campaign of total defense. They instituted send-off parties at community centers. Instead of a somber, fearful departure, the enlistment day was turned into a festival. Local members of parliament would show up to shake hands. Bands would play. The government framed the recruit not as a victim of the state, but as a hero of the community. They elevated the status of the soldier. They began to prioritize reservists for jobs and housing. Slowly, the stigma began to erode. The nail became the shield. The training itself was modeled on the Israeli doctrine brought by the Mexicans, and it was designed to break the softness of the city dweller. Singaporeans were used to the comforts of the city, however meager. The SAF training threw them into the swamps. They learned to survive on hardtack and muddy water. They learned to navigate the jungle at night. This was the rugged society that Lee Kuan Yew preached about. He believed that the tropics bred laziness, and that the only way to counteract the softening effects of the equator was through rigorous discipline. He wanted a population that was physically robust, mentally alert, and paranoid. This paranoia was cultivated as a virtue. The indoctrination within the NS camps relentlessly drove home the siege mentality. Recruits were taught the history of the Japanese occupation, how the British surrendered, how the locals were massacred on the beaches. They were taught about the confrontasi bombings. They were taught about the water vulnerability. The political education officers drilled a single message into their heads. No one owes us a living. No one owes us survival. The world is a dangerous place, and we are alone. This created a citizen army that was uniquely motivated. They weren't fighting for imperial glory. They were fighting because they genuinely believed that if they failed, their families would be wiped out. The fear that Lee Kuan Yew felt in 1965 was successfully injected into the bloodstream of every 18-year-old male in the country. The transformation was visible within a few years. The ragtag collection of volunteers and colonial police auxiliaries vanished. In their place stood the Singapore Armed Forces, SAF, a real mechanized fighting force. By the early 1970s, Singapore could mobilize tens of thousands of soldiers within hours. These were not ceremonial troops. They were fit. They were armed with the modern M16 rifle, which Singapore began to manufacture domestically under license, another step in the poison shrimp plan. And they knew how to execute complex maneuvers. But the most profound change was in the streets. The trader mentality had been augmented with a warrior ethos. The young men walking down Orchard Road on the weekends walked differently. They were fitter. They had a sense of ownership over the country. Before 1967, Singapore was a place where people lived to make money. After 1967, it was a place they were sworn to defend with their lives. The concept of citizenship became inextricably linked with the concept of soldiering. You could not be a full citizen in the moral sense if you had not served. There were, of course, deep challenges. The integration of Malays into the SAF was a sensitive and often painful issue. In the early years, due to the fear of conflict with Malaysia or Indonesia, many Malay recruits were sidelined into the police or fire service or kept out of sensitive intelligence and armor units. This created a scar of mistrust that took decades to heal. It was the dark side of the poison shrimp, the fear that some parts of the shrimp might be sympathetic to the fish. But even this exclusion reinforced the central narrative. Defense was the supreme imperative, overruling even the stated goals of multicultural equality when the chips were down. Survival came first. Social niceties came second. By the time the first few batches of national servicemen cycled into the reserves, the poisoned shrimp had hardened its shell. The fish in the neighborhood, Malaysia and Indonesia, looked at Singapore and saw something different. They no longer saw a chaotic port city ripe for plundering. They saw a garrison state. They saw a population that was disciplined, organized, and armed. They saw that to invade Singapore would mean fighting not just a professional army, but every postman, banker, and taxi driver on the island. The engineering of the soul was Lee Kuan Yew's greatest magic trick. He took a population of immigrants who had come to Singapore solely for economic gain, people who had no loyalty to the soil, and he turned them into stakeholders. He made them pay for their citizenship with their sweat and their time. In doing so, he cemented the reality of the nation. Singapore ceased to be a temporary market and became a permanent fortress. The merchant had learned to hold the spear, and once he held it, he realized he had something worth protecting. The poison shrimp was now alive, and it was dangerous. But Lee Kuan Yew knew that manpower alone was not enough. 1,000,000 soldiers with rifles are useless if they are starving or if their tanks run out of gas. To sustain this war machine, he needed to pull off another miracle. He needed to figure out how to pay for a first-world military with a third-world economy. In the annals of nation-building, there exists a classic dilemma that haunts every finance minister: the choice between guns and butter. It is the fundamental economic trade-off. A dollar spent on a tank is a dollar not spent on a hospital. A dollar spent on a rifle is a dollar stolen from a school lunch program. For a developing nation in the 1960s, teeming with slums, unemployment, and malnutrition, the moral choice seemed obvious. You choose butter. You feed your people. You build homes to replace the squalid kampongs. But Singapore, under the terrifying logic of the poison shrimp, defied this universal law of economics. Lee Kuan Yew and his cabinet decided that they would buy the guns, even if it meant scraping the butter off the bread of an entire generation. They gambled the national treasury on the belief that a starving man is miserable, but a dead man is silent. To ensure the survival of the state, they had to pull off the greatest financial magic trick of the Cold War, building a first-world military on a third-world budget without bankrupting the country or triggering a revolution among the poor. The architect of this impossible equation was Dr. Goh Keng Swee. If Lee Kuan Yew was the voice of Singapore and the iron will behind its survival, Goh Keng Swee was its brain. He was a man of towering intellect, a PhD. Economist who served at various times as both the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Defense. In most governments, these two ministries are natural enemies. The Defense Minister asks for money and the Finance Minister says no. In Singapore, Goh Keng Swee was essentially negotiating with himself. This allowed for a synchronization of strategy that was unique in the world. Goh understood that the standard guns versus butter argument was a fallacy for Singapore. For a tiny island with no natural resources, security was not a luxury. It was the only asset. Multinational corporations, looking at the chaos of Southeast Asia, would only invest in Singapore if they believed their factories would not be burned down by rioters or seized by invading armies. Therefore, defense spending was not a drain on the economy. It was an investment in the economy. It was the insurance premium that made the house habitable. Driven by this logic, the Singaporean government allocated a staggering percentage of its budget to defense. In the critical years following independence, defense spending consumed up to 40% of government expenditure and nearly 10% of the entire gross domestic product, GDP. These are wartime numbers. For comparison, most NATO countries today struggle to spend 2%. To sustain this level of spending in a country where people were still using bucket toilets required a ruthless austerity in other sectors and a political dominance that bordered on the absolute. Lee Kuan Yew told his people the hard truth: we have to pay for our own protection. There is no free lunch and there is no free freedom. The government taxed, they saved, and they diverted funds with a singular obsession. They were buying the hardware of survival. But hardware is useless if the enemy knows what you have and how to counter it. This brings us to the most cinematic episode of Singapore's military acquisition history, the secret of the tanks. By 1968, the strategic balance between Singapore and Malaysia was dangerously lopsided. The Malaysian armed forces possessed armored cars and were established professional units. Singapore's infantry was light, exposed, and mobile only by truck. If the Malaysians decided to cross the causeway, they would have the advantage of armor. Singapore needed a counterweight. They needed a shock weapon, but they couldn't just buy tanks from anyone. The British were reluctant to sell offensive heavy weaponry that might upset the balance of power in the Commonwealth. The Americans were tied down in Vietnam. So, once again, Singapore turned to the Israelis. The Israeli military advisors recommended the AMX-13. It was a French-made light tank, peculiar in design with an oscillating turret and an automatic loading system. It was not the heaviest tank in the world, but it was fast, agile, and crucially, light enough to cross the fragile bridges of rural Malaysia and operate in the soft, swampy ground of the tropics where heavier British Centurion tanks would sink. It was the perfect weapon for the poison shrimp, small, mobile, and carrying a gun big enough to punch through enemy armor. In absolute secrecy, Singapore purchased 72 of these tanks from Israel, who were upgrading to heavier American armor, and France. The logistics of the transfer were a masterclass in covert operations. The tanks were shipped to Singapore under the guise of agricultural machinery and industrial equipment. When they arrived at the docks, they were unloaded at night under heavy guard and whisked away to underground bunkers and remote depots. For months, the rumors swirled. Did Singapore have tanks? The Malaysian intelligence services suspected something, but they had no proof. The Mexicans, the Israeli advisors, were training Singaporean crews in the jungle, teaching them the art of armored warfare, shoot and scoot, flank and destroy. The reveal was orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. The date was August 9, 1969, Singapore's National Day Parade. The relationship with Malaysia was at its nadir. Just months earlier, the 1969 race riots in Kuala Lumpur had spilled over into tensions in Singapore. The atmosphere was toxic. The Malaysians were confident in their military superiority. Then, the ground began to shake. As the parade marched past City Hall, the rumble of diesel engines drowned out the bands. Out of the smoke emerged column after column of AMX-13 tanks, their tracks clattering on the asphalt, their 75mm guns pointed at the sky. The shock was electric. It was felt not just by the crowd, but in the embassies and government offices in Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta. In a single afternoon, the balance of power had shifted. Singapore didn't just have a few ceremonial armored cars, they had a tank division. They had more armor than Malaysia. It was a geopolitical thunderclap. Lee Kuan Yew stood on the podium, saluting the tanks, sending a silent, terrifying message to his neighbors. We can fight on the ground. We can cross bridges. We are not just a shrimp. We have a shell. The AMX-13 purchase was the ultimate poison shrimp maneuver, a hidden capability revealed only when it was too late for the enemy to react. It bought Singapore a decade of peace through sheer intimidation. But Goh Keng Swee knew that buying weapons was a trap. If you buy your rifle from the Americans, you are beholden to their foreign policy. If you buy your bullets from the British, they can cut off your supply if they disapprove of your war. True sovereignty required autarky. Singapore needed to make its own swords. This led to the creation of the Chartered Industries of Singapore, CIS, the precursor to today's ST Engineering. The story of CIS is the story of industrial alchemy. In 1967, Singapore had no industrial base. It barely had factories to make toothpaste, let alone assault rifles. Goh Keng Swee approached the Colt Manufacturing Company in the United States with a bold proposition. Don't just sell us the M16 rifle. Sell us the license to build it. The Americans were skeptical. The M16 was a sophisticated weapon, requiring precision machining and high-quality materials. Could this tiny island really manufacture it? Goh Keng Swee bet the farm that they could. He set up a factory in Jurong, staffing it with meticulous Chinese craftsmen and engineers. The symbolism of this factory was profound. The first facility of the Chartered Industries was actually a mint, a place to print money. Goh Keng Swee famously quipped that, "If we can make money, we can make bullets." The two were produced side by side. It was the physical manifestation of the economy-defense nexus. The factory produced the first Singaporean-made M16 rifles, the M16S1. But they didn't stop there. They realized that in a war the first thing to run out is ammunition. Singapore is an island. A naval blockade could starve its guns in a week. So they began to manufacture ammunition on a massive scale. They produced millions of rounds, far more than the training requirements. They stockpiled them in hollowed-out caverns beneath the central hills of the island. Singapore became a fortress sitting on a powder keg. This drive for self-sufficiency birthed a military-industrial complex that became a pillar of the economy. ST Engineering did not just supply the Singapore Armed Forces, SAF. It began to export. Singapore started selling weapons to the world. They developed their own artillery systems, like the FH-88 and later the Primus. They built their own armored personnel carriers, the Bionics. The poison shrimp began to manufacture its own poison. This was Goh Keng Swee's genius. He turned the cost of defense into a revenue stream. The engineers trained to build weapons eventually moved into the civilian sector, boosting the country's aerospace and electronics industries. The burden of defense became the engine of technological modernization. The economic sacrifice was real. For a generation, Singaporeans lived in small flats and worked long hours, knowing that a huge chunk of their tax money was going to things that exploded. But the gamble paid off. The strong defense provided the stability that attracted multinational giants like Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, and Shell. These companies looked at the tanks, looked at the disciplined reservists, and looked at the stable government, and they decided that Singapore was the safest vault in Asia for their capital. The guns effectively secured the butter. By the mid-1970s, the poison shrimp was no longer just a metaphor, it was a mechanized reality. Singapore had the tanks to hold the line, the rifles to arm every citizen, and the factories to sustain a war effort even if the world turned its back. They had achieved the impossible. They had militarized the economy without destroying it. They proved that for a small nation there is no choice between butter and cannons. You buy the cannons so that no one steals your butter. And if you are smart, like Goh Keng Swee, you build a factory that makes both, ensuring that the shrimp is not only poisonous, but also profitable. The message was clear to any potential aggressor looking across the strait. Singapore was open for business, but it was closed to invasion, and the price of entry for an enemy army was now calculated in 75mm high-explosive shells, manufactured right there in Jurong. The poison shrimp strategy was a masterstroke of 1960s realpolitik. It saved Singapore from the immediate threat of being swallowed whole by its neighbors. It bought the fledgling nation the most precious commodity of all, time. But as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, Lee Kuan Yew and his military architects began to look at their creation with a critical, unsentimental eye. They realized that the poison shrimp had a fatal, tragic flaw inherent in its very name. In nature, for a poison shrimp to kill a predator, it must first be eaten. The strategy was essentially a suicide pact. It was a doctrine of mutually assured destruction on a microscale. It promised the Malaysians and the Indonesians that if they invaded, Singapore would fight to the last man, turning the city into a burning graveyard that would infect the occupier with a terminal insurgency. But in this scenario, Singapore still dies. The skyscrapers burn, the people perish, and the economy is vaporized. For a poor nation with nothing to lose, this nihilistic deterrence was acceptable. But Singapore was no longer poor. By the 1980s, the swamp had been replaced by a metropolis. The central business district was rising. The port was one of the busiest in the world. Foreign investment was pouring in billions of dollars. Singapore now had something to lose. It had assets, it had wealth, and it had a future. Lee Kuan Yew realized that a strategy based on national martyrdom was no longer politically or economically viable. You cannot tell a population of affluent, educated citizens that the plan is to die painfully, to spite the enemy. The strategy had to evolve. The shrimp had to grow up. This realization birthed the second phase of Singapore's military evolution, the porcupine doctrine. The shift in animal metaphor was deliberate and profound. A porcupine does not need to be eaten to hurt you. It establishes a perimeter of pain. It signals to the predator that the mere act of getting close will result in injury. The goal shifted from post-occupation insurgency to pre-invasion deterrence. The Singapore Armed Forces, SF, moved away from the idea of fighting a guerrilla war in the ruins of HDB flats and focused on conventional defense. They built a hardened shell around the island. This era saw the massive expansion of the Republic of Singapore Air Force, RSAF. The logic was simple. If you control the air, you control the battle. Singapore began to acquire American combat aircraft, the F-5 Tigers, the A-4 Skyhawks, and later the F-16 Falcons, in numbers that dazzled the region. They weren't just buying planes, they were buying an umbrella of steel. The Porcupine strategy was about denial. It was about creating a layered defense system, surface-to-air missiles, coastal artillery, and rapid-reaction naval vessels that would shred any force attempting to cross the Singapore Strait or the Causeway. The psychological message to the neighbors changed. It was no longer, swallow me and die. It was, don't even touch me. The SAF began to conduct large-scale conventional exercises, demonstrating their ability to repel an amphibious landing or hold a defensive line. The reserves became more professional, the equipment became heavier. This was the era of the total defense concept solidifying, where every aspect of society, civil, economic, social, psychological, and military, was integrated into a defensive wall. The Porcupine was prickly, it was alert, and it was dug in. But as the 1990s arrived, with the end of the Cold War and the explosion of military technology, even the Porcupine was deemed insufficient. Lee Kuan Yew, now the senior minister, but still the strategic conscience of the nation, recognized a terrifying geographical reality that no amount of armor could fix. Singapore lacks strategic depth. In military terms, strategic depth is the space you have to retreat, regroup, and absorb an enemy attack. Russia has strategic depth. They can trade land for time. Singapore is 42 kilometers long and 23 kilometers wide. You can drive across it in 40 minutes. There is no rear area. The front line is the bus stop outside your house. This geography dictates a terrifying truth. Singapore cannot afford to fight a war on its own soil. If a single enemy artillery shell lands in the financial district, the stock market crashes, the insurance rates skyrocket, and the economy collapses. Even if the SAF wins the battle, Singapore loses the war because its reputation as a safe haven is destroyed. Therefore, the Porcupine's defensive posture, waiting for the enemy to come to you, was flawed. If you wait for the enemy to attack, the fighting happens in Jurong, in Changi, in Ang Mo Kio. The collateral damage would be unacceptable. Thus, the doctrine evolved again into its current and most aggressive form. Military analysts have called it the Dolphin, for its intelligence and agility, or the Wasp, small but capable of inflicting paralyzing stings far larger than its size. The core tenet of this third generation is forward defense and preemptive strike. The thesis is brutal. If war is inevitable, it must be fought in the enemy's territory, not ours. The Singapore Armed Forces transformed into an expeditionary force. They stopped training solely to defend the beaches of Singapore and started training to seize the beaches of the aggressor. The acquisition of hardware reflected this shift. Singapore bought mid-air refueling tankers, allowing their fighter jets to fly far beyond the immediate neighborhood. They bought submarines, the Challenger, Archer, and now the Invincible class, from Sweden and Germany. Why does a tiny island need submarines? Not to patrol the coast, but to hunt. To sink the enemy's navy in their own ports before they can even set sail. To cut off the enemy's trade routes thousands of miles away. The Dolphin is smart. It relies on superior intelligence, command and control. Singapore invested billions in C4I, command, control, communications, computers and intelligence. They launched their own satellites. They bought Gulfstream jets modified with Israeli radar to act as airborne early warning systems, G550 CAEW. This gave them the eye of God. The SAF could now see an enemy plane taking off from a runway in Java, or a tank engine starting up in Johor before it even moved. This technological superiority allows for the preemptive strike doctrine. It is the unspoken, polite threat that hangs over the region. The neighbors know that Singapore will not wait to be hit. At the first sign of imminent hostilities, the undeniable intent of war, the RSAF will launch. They will destroy the enemy's air force on the ground. The army, highly mechanized and mobile, will push rapidly into the enemy's territory to create a buffer zone. They will seize the water reservoirs in Johor to secure the supply. They will disable the enemy's command centers. They will ensure that the smoke and the rubble are in Kuala Lumpur or Jakarta, not in Singapore. This evolution is the ultimate expression of the poison becoming power. The SAF is no longer just a deterrent force. It is the most potent military instrument in Southeast Asia. It is a third-generation 3G fighting force, networked and lethal. It integrates the Army, Navy, and Air Force into a single fighting unit. A soldier on the ground can use a laser to paint a target, and a fighter jet 10 miles away will drop a smart bomb on it within seconds. The shift to the Dolphin Wasp strategy also reflects a change in national confidence. The poison shrimp was the strategy of a victim, a creature expecting to be eaten. The wasp is a predator. It projects power. Singapore now participates in international peacekeeping missions. It sends assets to the Middle East. It trains in Australia, the US, and India. It signals that Singapore is not just a rock in the ocean, it is an active player in global security. Kuan lived to see this final evolution. He saw the ragtag volunteers of 1965 transform into the high-tech cyber warriors of the 2000s. He saw the desperation of the early years replaced by a cold, professional confidence. But he never let the country forget the root of the strategy. Even as the SAF bought F-35 stealth fighters, Lee reminded them that the technology was useless without the will. The wasp must be willing to sting. The evolution of the species was not about changing the goal, survival, but about changing the method. The poison shrimp said, "If you kill me, I will poison you." The porcupine said, "If you touch me, you will bleed." The dolphin wasp says, "If you think about attacking me, I will know, and I will end you before you even leave your house." This aggressive posture is controversial. Some critics argue it fuels an arms race in the region. But for Singapore, a country with zero margin for error, fairness is not the objective. Survival is the objective. And in the view of Kuan, it is better to be a wasp that everyone respects and fears than a shrimp that everyone pities while they prepare the cocktail sauce. The evolution of the strategy ensured that Singapore moved from being a target to being a power. It was the final checkmate in Lee's lifelong game of chess against geography. He couldn't make the island bigger, so he made its shadow longer. As we stand at the precipice of the 21st century, looking down at the gleaming, futuristic skyline of Marina Bay, it is almost impossible to reconcile this vision of hyper-modernity with the tearful, fragile beginning of 1965. The journey we have traced, from the weeping Prime Minister to the arrival of the Mexicans, from the muddy boot camps of the first National Service intake to the secret purchase of tanks, has culminated in a reality that defies the laws of political physics. Today, the Republic of Singapore is no longer a vulnerable shrimp waiting to be swallowed. It is the apex predator of Southeast Asia. The legacy of Kuan Yew's frantic, obsessive drive for security is not just a history lesson. It is audible in the roar of the jet engines that tear through the sky every year on National Day. It is visible in the silent, terrifying efficiency of a military machine that is widely considered the most advanced in the region and arguably, pound for pound, one of the most lethal in the world. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, one only needs to look at the hardware. The Singapore of today does not beg for outdated surplus equipment. It operates at the bleeding edge of military technology. The Republic of Singapore Air Force, RSAF, flies the F-15SG, a custom-built variant of the American air superiority fighter, equipped with radars and avionics so advanced they outclass almost anything in the skies of its neighbors. And it has gone further, joining the exclusive club of nations operating the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, a stealth platform that acts as a flying supercomputer capable of seeing the enemy long before the enemy knows they are being watched. Possessing such weaponry is a geopolitical statement. It signals that the United States trusts Singapore with its most sensitive technology, a level of trust not granted to many allies. It also signals to Malaysia and Indonesia that the window for a military solution to any diplomatic dispute has closed forever. The disparity is no longer just about numbers, it is about generations. While neighbors are flying jets from the 1980s or 90s, Singapore is operating in the digital future. The poison shrimp has evolved into a technological titan. Kuan Yew's gamble, that spending 40% of the budget on defense would eventually pay off, has been vindicated. The guns protected the butter so effectively that Singapore became rich enough to buy the most expensive guns in the world. But Kuan Yew's true legacy in global security is not found in the cockpit of a fighter jet. It is found in the mind of the Singaporean citizen. The greatest fortification he built was not made of concrete but of psychology. This is the concept of total defense. In the mid-1980s, the government realized that a military is only as strong as the society that supports it. If the army is strong but the economy is weak, the nation collapses. If the economy is strong but the people are divided by race, the nation fractures. If the people are united but terrified of psychological warfare, the nation surrenders. Total defense codified the survival instinct into 5 pillars: military, civil, economic, social, and psychological defense, and later, digital defense. It turned the entire country into a redundant system. Civil defense means that every citizen knows what to do in a bomb shelter. Economic defense means the stock market and supply chains can keep running during a crisis. Social defense means maintaining racial harmony so that an enemy cannot use divide and conquer tactics. Psychological defense is the will to fight. This holistic approach is studied by military colleges around the world today. It acknowledges that modern wars are not just fought with tanks, they are fought with disinformation, with viruses, with economic blockades. By preparing the population for total war, Kuan ensured total peace. He created a society that is resilient, not just resistant. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, or when global financial crises erupted, the mechanisms of total defense kicked in. The system designed to stop an invading army was flexible enough to stop a virus or a recession. This is the genius of the architecture. The war machine doubles as a nation-building machine. The result of this decades-long project is a geopolitical phenomenon known as the armed peace. Singapore lives in a state of high tension but low conflict. It is a peace guaranteed by the barrel of a gun. The relationship with Malaysia and Indonesia has matured. The days of confrontasi and threats to cut off the water are largely gone. Why? Because the cost of aggression has become mathematically impossible to justify. A Malaysian general looking across the causeway today does not see a victim. He sees a force capable of neutralizing his command centers within minutes. This deterrence has stabilized the entire region. Paradoxically, by arming itself to the teeth, Singapore has made Southeast Asia more peaceful. A weak Singapore was a temptation, a vacuum inviting adventure. A strong Singapore is an anchor, a known quantity that stabilizes the map. Kuan proved the ancient Roman adage, "Si vis pacem para bellum," if you want peace, prepare for war. But he took it a step further. He proved that if you prepare for war thoroughly enough, perfectly enough, and visibly enough, you will never have to fight it. The Singapore Armed Forces is the only military in the world that considers itself successful only if it never fires a shot in anger. Its victory is defined by its non-use. Every day that passes without an air raid siren is a validation of the billions of dollars spent. Critics often point to the cost. They ask if a small island really needs submarines and stealth fighters. They ask if the society is too regimented, too paranoid. But Kuan's answer would be to point to the history books. He would point to Kuwait in 1990, a wealthy, small state that thought its money would protect it, only to be swallowed by a larger neighbor in an afternoon. He would point to Ukraine. He would argue that fairness and international law are concepts that only matter when you have the power to enforce them. For a small state, disarmament is suicide. The paranoia is the price of existence. As we conclude this story, we must reflect on the man who sat weeping in 1965. Kuan defied the verdict of history. He was told that a small nation without natural resources could not survive. He was told that a multicultural island in a sectarian region would tear itself apart. He was told that he could not afford an army. He proved them all wrong. He proved that geography is not destiny. He proved that size is not destiny. Will is destiny. The strategy of the poison shrimp was, at its core, a bluff that became a reality. It started as a desperate warning, "I might die, but I will hurt you." It became a confident declaration, "I will not die, and you cannot hurt me." The ultimate legacy of Kuan is that he bestowed upon Singapore the rarest privilege a small nation can possess, the privilege of being left alone. He bought his people the right to determine their own future, free from the coercion of larger powers. Today, the little red dot is a fortress of glass and steel, prosperous beyond the wildest dreams of the colonial era. But beneath the manicured gardens and the air-conditioned malls, the heart of the poison shrimp still beats. The reservists still pack their bags every year. The sirens still sound on total defense day. The fighter jets still scramble at a moment's notice. The nation has never forgotten the fear of day zero, and because it remembers the fear, it has mastered the art of survival. The supreme excellence of war, according to Sun Tzu, is to subdue the enemy without fighting. By that metric, Kuan was one of the greatest generals of the 20th century. He fought a 50-year war against the odds, against his neighbors and against history itself, and he won. Singapore stands today not as a monument to war, but as a monument to the armed, vigilant, and unbreakable peace that only strength can provide. The shrimp survived the ocean of predators, not by hiding but by becoming the most dangerous creature in the water.